Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, your favorite professional resource for evidence-based practice in speech-language pathology. I'm Kate Granbois.
And I'm Amy Wonka. We are both speech-language pathologists working in the field and co-founders of SLP Nerdcast.
Each episode of this podcast is a course offered for ASHA CEUs. Our podcast audio courses are here to help you level up your knowledge and earn those professional development hours that you need. This course, plus the corresponding short post-test, is equal to 1 certificate of attendance. To earn CEUs today and take the post-test after this session, follow the link provided in the show notes or head to slpnerdcast.com.
Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Our courses are not meant to replace clinical advice. We do not endorse products, procedures, or other services mentioned by our guests unless otherwise specified.
We hope you enjoy the course.
Are you an SLP or related professional? The SLP Nerdcast Unlimited subscription gives members access to over 100 courses offered for ASHA CEUs and certificates of attendance. With SLP Nerdcast membership, you can earn unlimited CEUs all year at any time. SLP Nerdcast courses are unique, evidence-based, with a focus on information that is useful. When you join SLP Nerdcast as a member, you'll have access to the best online platform for continuing education in speech and language pathology. Join as a member today and save 10% using code NERDCASTER10. A link for membership is in the show notes.
This episode is made possible in part by listeners like you and our corporate sponsor, Sparrow Stuttering, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the stuttering community and the SLPs who serve them. Visit sparrowstuttering.org to learn more.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. We're super excited for today's episode. We have the pleasure of welcoming a special guest, Rutger Wilhelm. Welcome, Rutger.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks for having me, of course.
We're very excited to have you. We, as we mentioned before we started this recording, I think we meant to record this 3 or 4 months ago, and between snowstorms and illnesses, we had to reschedule a million times. So we're so glad to all be in this room today and have it all work out. Before we get started, Rutger, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, of course. Well, yeah. So, yes. Well, first of all, actually, sorry about this. First of all, I'm Dutch, so I may, have to look for search for some words, during my talk here, basically. So, so people would know this, of course, and of course, I'm also a person with cluttering, and I have had that for my entire life, of course, right? But I only know about it, I think, since 12 years ago or something. For the first time, I heard that term, and and actually since then, things started rolling for me, basically, right? So I started, to look for more information about that. Actually, I started joining, some stuttering and cluttering organization as well. So, for example, I started in the consumer committee of the ICA, which is the International Cluttering Association, and also the ISA, so the International Stuttering Association, for example, and I'm also in the Dutch Stuttering Association, by the way. Yeah, so in all kinds of organizations, and now I'm, by the way, also in the World Stuttering and Cluttering Organization in the consumer committee. So yeah, so I'm pretty much everywhere. But for me, of course, it's so the overall goal for me, of course, is to get the story out, right? So to raise more awareness on cluttering, because it's still, well, still rather limited. Most people don't know, a thing about it. So yeah, so for me, that is really important. And I think I can close the, this answer by saying, that I have, had lots of questions and lots of, well, also difficulties, of course, in the past, with cluttering. So yeah, let's maybe, talk about that, for example, further.
That's going to be great. We are also joined today by my co-host, Dr. Anna Paula Mumi. Welcome, Anna Paula.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
as our audience knows, I know very, very little about anything in the realm of stuttering and especially cluttering. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation and learning a lot from both of you today, for sure. Before we get into the good stuff, I do need to read our learning objectives. Learning objective number 1. List at least one variable that may have an impact on the lives of a person who clutters. And learning objective number 2, list at least one way an individual's experience with cluttering might differ between childhood and adulthood. Anna Paula, do you want to start off our conversation by just, I don't know, share a piece of knowledge or ask a question? Go for it.
Yes. Well, let's just start with your story, Rutger. I'd love to hear any part of your story that you are willing to share, and just start at the beginning or wherever you'd like.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks, Anna. Well, look. Okay. So I think it all started. Well, I think when I was about 8 years old or something, 8, 9, 10 years old. And because, well, obviously, me and my parents, of course, and my, and my peers and so on, they had noticed something, that something was wrong, in my speech, and of course I had, the same feeling and the same, the same experiences as well, but I didn't, really know what it was basically. I mean, I knew, that I was, well, sort of stuttering or something, but I never, got stuck in my words, for example, and I also knew of course, that I was speaking so really fast, but I never knew how fast it was, right? So, and that is also, one of the most tricky things in cluttering, I think, because most people clutter don't understand or don't realize how fast they're going, or in other words, how their environment, for example, sees them as a speaker, or experience that, so how those words and those stories of people clutter, actually, come across to them basically. So, and that is also a very, very important part, also of course in therapy later on, but also, back then, when I was younger. So, yeah, so again, I just noticed all kinds of complaints from other people as well, also, from myself. And so when I was older, I think it was, like 13 years old or something, I went into therapy for the first time in my life. So I went to a, really seasoned lady. She was really, really experienced and so on, but she had only experience with stuttering, with people who stutter. So she basically, what she did was, well, make me do all kinds of exercises, and she actually, asked me to do the stuttering exercises instead of the things that I actually needed, which were of course the cluttering exercises. But back then there was no, well, I mean, not so much knowledge, at least on cluttering, of course. So yeah, so this lady, didn't really understand my question or my problems, right? Yeah, well, so yeah, and so I didn't, well, yeah, didn't know exactly, how to move on, basically, from after that. And so, yeah, there was a whole period of searching, searching for the right therapy, searching for the right solution, basically, because I felt somehow I felt inside, that I wasn't a true stutterer, of course, so I felt that there should be a solution somewhere, but I didn't, just didn't know where to go, or and so, and yeah, and then after a few therapies, which were all focused on stuttering things, so for example, breathing techniques, or what was it called again? The easy onset. Do you all know that? Yeah, so actually starting off with a smooth, soft or smooth start, of your sentence or your words, but those techniques didn't really address my core problem, because cluttering, of course, is well, very much bound to, well, also language planning. For me, for me at least, language planning is the most important part. There are also things like, the articulation, for example, so the phonological part of cluttering. But for me, it was really the other part. And so, yeah, and and so I just was just on the outlook for a solution again, which I found only when I was 34 years old. So I was at a meeting somewhere from the Dutch Association, by the way, and then some lady told me, and she actually said to me, Rutger, I don't know you, but I have the feeling that you don't stutter, but you clutter. So and then I was like, I do what? I'm sorry, I'm cluttering, and then the whole process started for me. And then like I told you already, I was diving into all kinds of books and all kinds of stories from theorists, from researchers basically. But what I was lacking as well were the stories of the real people, but people who clutter. So and that's why I wrote my own book about this. But that's for later. So yeah. So again, a whole process of about 25 years of just not knowing what was the matter with me. So I think that is the first answer to to your question.
I would love to hear then. So you essentially were diagnosed incorrectly, right? Or when you were evaluated, the diagnosis that came was that you are stuttering, not there was never any mentioning. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's correct.
Okay. I am interested to know, you said, I knew intuitively or in your heart, like, I'm not stuttering, like, this is not right. So
Yeah.
like, what were some of the characteristics, just to differentiate, I think, for our listeners, what are the things that were most evident in your speech that maybe differ from stuttered speech? If you could elaborate on that, I think that would be helpful
Sure.
for our listeners.
Sure. Okay. Well. First of all, the pace of speech. So for example, in stuttering, people with stuttering, they have a much lower pace of speaking, of course, which is also much more constant, right? So in cluttering, basically, your speech, your rate of speech is too high, but also to let's say what's the word again? Sorry. It varies a lot. So sometimes it's really fast, and sometimes it's somehow slower or something. But so the average speed is still too high. You know what I mean? And there are many spurs as well in my speech. And so that is the first main character, basically, a feature. And also in cluttering, people take too few pauses, for example, or they take their pauses in the wrong way, so maybe too long sometimes as well, or too few pauses, and so on. So that's also a main characteristic. But I would also say, of course, again, that language planning, right? So, well, actually, planning your entire story. So from the beginning to the end, basically, and all the steps in between, but also, retrieving words from your, I think it's called the lexicon. Well, I'm sure you would know that. But so actually, just retrieving words from your brain. That also is suboptimal, so to speak, in cluttering speakers. So it takes more time to do that. But also, what I just mentioned again, the auditory feedback part, right? So we don't hear ourselves back the same way as you, for example, hear me talking right now. So, and that's really important as well, because then clutterers are sometimes lacking the urgency of doing something about it. And also, I think what is really important is to mention that people with stuttering are by nature are more extroverted than people with stuttering, or that's a bit of the egg chicken story or something. Do you know what I mean? So what is the beginning? Is it because stutter, the people who stutter I know are much more introverted, in my opinion at least, and they are they don't tend to talk that much But is it because of them stuttering, or is it just because of their nature? That's also a question for me. But anyway, the people I know who clutter, at least, they're all extroverted, tend to talk a lot as well, like me again. And, so yeah, so they actually don't have any problems or fear of speaking as well, whereas stuttering people do have that much more often. But people clutter can have the fear of being ignored, by other people because, well, I mean, they would all know, examples, for example, of people walking away from a conversation or just, saying nothing to them or frowning their eyes and their eyebrows, and so, and, and those are all signs of, things that they are thinking but not saying to people clutter, right? But yeah, maybe we'll come to that later on as well in this podcast. But yeah, so there are actually many features of cluttering that are much different from stuttering.
Something that you mentioned that I would like to briefly comment on is this idea that people who clutter might be more extroverted and that people who stutter may be more introverted. And I think that in my work with people who stutter, what I have found is not so much that they are inherently introverted, but I think oftentimes the perception might be that they talk less or are more quiet or may not be as socially vocal or bubbly or eager to talk. But not so much because they're introverts, but because there is either a fear of talking or a fear of stuttering that so often is a part of the stuttering experience, especially when there's been traumatic experiences or when there just hasn't been a lot of that internal work done to maybe shed some of that fear and to approach situations and people and so on. So I just thought I would make mention of that. And actually, what I have found is sometimes some of that internal work takes place and people do build more confidence. One of the signs of progress is that they do come out of their shell and that they do feel like they can show themselves in the way that they have always wanted to show themselves, which is more extroverted. So that sometimes can be a sign of progress. Would you say that you have any co-occurrence of stuttering in terms of repetitions, or like does your cluttering appear to be stuttering in some moments, or what does that look like?
Oh yeah, sure. So for example, when I'm tense, for example, or when I'm afraid, or or something, yeah, then my cluttering gets worse, and then it can also almost jump into stuttering as well. So again, I don't have too many stuttering moments or something, or stutters, but I can quite easily sometimes enter into stuttering as well. And then this is some kind of vicious circle. Then yeah, things start to. I mean, then I'm going to stutter as well. So yeah, so that depends on the circumstances, yeah, that I'm in. But in general, I don't really have much stuttering features or something. Yeah, and so my therapist, she actually also called me a pure clutterer. But yeah, like now, for example, I'm there's this small hiccup, or at least, all right, there's a small stuttering hiccup, perhaps. Yeah, so I can also show some stuttering features, perhaps.
I think one key, just from my perception, based on what you said, that you never felt stuck. And I think that's one really key characteristic with stuttering, is that internal sense of being stuck and that loss of control that comes with that stuck feeling. And so that might be one distinguishing feature. And like you said, the either fast pace, the irregular pace, certainly being a big part of that. And as you mentioned, just the planning piece in being able to get out what you want to say in a way that is sequenced or organized and so on. So certainly that's a good, those are great distinctions. I think that's important to point out.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly.
I had a question. I am wondering the process of receiving a more accurate diagnosis. Was that a really, how did that impact you? I assume that was a positive experience in a lot of ways, but could you talk a little bit about what the impact was for receiving a more accurate diagnosis?
Well, to me, it was, huge, to be honest. It was, such a relief, because, finally I learned, that there was something that I was doing, right? So finally I learned, there was a name for it in the first place, right? So just to give you an example, when I was in a stuttering therapy before, for example, I just noticed that all these stuttering, colleagues of mine, or the stuttering peers of mine, they very very often said to me, Rucker, why don't you just slow down? For example, because then then it's just then your problem is gone basically. And but that is not that easy for people to do. So I just felt a lack of understanding. You know what I mean? And that was for a long time. So like 25 years, I didn't felt understood. I didn't felt recognized for the way I was talking. So yeah. So then when this diagnosis came, I was just I was driving back home, and all I was thinking was, you see, I don't stutter. I just don't stutter. There is a solution for me. I clutter apparently, but there is a solution for me to to hold on to, and to improve my way of speaking basically as well, and of course also improving parts of my life with that. So yeah, to me it was just awesome.
Thank you for sharing that. I would imagine so. And I'm so glad that you were able to go on that journey. I think it's an important question for those who are listening, who are likely clinically practicing speech language pathologists, just to think about the impact of being thoughtful about our diagnostic processes and what knowledge we're bringing to the table to make sure we're working within our expertise and moving through that accurately. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course, yeah.
What would you say, thinking about our audience of SLPs, what would you say would be really crucial suggestions or tips or just things to consider as we are working with people who stutter, who may also clutter, or who may be what you call pure clutterers? What would be some things that you would share that would be important for SLPs to know?
Well, first, of course, I think be like Kate already said, be open to more stories, and of course and more information about a sort of new condition that is out there. That is really important, because you can help people who were misdiagnosed in the past, as well. So that, I think that's really important to say, and of course also it is possible to, for SLP, so for your audience, to help people who clutter. So it's possible for them as well to take more control over their lives. It's not easy, but it's, I mean, it's partly possible at least. So for me as well, so for example, well, now I'm feeling as well, that I'm quite aroused. I'm, my energy level is quite high. And my pitch of speaking is quite high maybe as well. But for example, when I'm going to work, then I'm so focused. I just know that at work I don't clutter. Well, or at least I almost don't clutter there, because I know what to do. I know how to focus actually. So, and then, for example, I'm using lower speech, like I'm doing now. So then I'm focusing much more on the planning part as well. So this is how I'm talking at work, right? And then then it feels like I'm in some kind of lazy chair. Do you know what I mean? It feels like I'm not, people don't get me out of that, because I'm just so confident. anything could happen, but I'm just in my chair, and so and that is how it feels. But of course that is something that I needed to learn, of course, obviously, by again by showing some speech techniques, of course, as well. Yeah, so I would say focus on these techniques as well, but obviously also focus on the mental part of it, because it's not easy to basically change your way of speaking. So, for example, I always get this example. If I would ask you for the next hour, which is nothing, it's only 1 hour, this is not your entire life, but it's only 1 hour to talk. For example, like this all the time. So you should talk, very, very, I don't know the word in English, but very,
Robotic.
robotic, exactly. Which is, this is difficult for you, even for 1 minute, perhaps, even for 10 minutes as well. But, so imagine, that, you're asking somebody to change the way their speaking habits. Well, basically, meant for their entire life. So again, that is very difficult, but it's possible for them to showcase these techniques when they want it, when they need it. For example, in job interviews, or giving presentations or whatever. So it's not only about speech techniques, but it's also about the mental part of that. And I also want to mention your environment. So how could they contribute to your, well, let's say, journey, or improvements process or something. So how could they for example, give you some signs when you should slow down in a conversation, or I don't know, there are many ways of helping people clutter. So for parents, for example, I would say, or teachers, I would say, because this happens a lot. They often say, why don't you slow down, or slow down, or it's so it's also in the way of giving feedback to people. Clutter, please, use the right way of giving feedback. So so to do that by the rules. And what I mean by that is basically, keep the things for yourself, please, at first. So don't say you should slow down, or you are the bad guy here, but just I don't understand you, because yeah, okay, you are going too fast, perhaps, for my for me to follow, for example. Those are the right things, but don't accuse people of speaking in the way they are just well used to, actually. So yeah, and yes, so yes, so more in general, try to be supportive, of course, as a parent, as a teacher, as a friend, and so on, as a family member as well to them. Yeah, and last but not least, I would also mention this thing, because lately there is a whole discussion going on in this stuttering landscape, right? It's about stigma. Yeah, I'm not sure if you heard about that, but stigma is a big thing now, and that means, well, obviously, the stigma that your environment puts on you, like you are the stutterer or you are the clutterer, so you should fix that, for example, right? And of course also the self stigma that we are, or a label, basically, that we are putting on ourselves. So to me, the question now has become as well, okay, although we know that a person with cluttering can do a lot about their his speech impediment. The question is also, should they I mean, yeah, should they actually do that? Should they? I mean, why should they be imposed, or no, so why do why do people expect people clutter, for example, or people stutter to do something about it? Of course, I understand that is not always comfortable for the audience or for the listeners, and it's, of course it's not always let's say easy to follow, easy to understand, and difficult for other people as well. But and yes, it's also true that it costs money for society and so on. But but you can't put the burden of that on people who stutter or people who clutter all the time. So the question is, why should we fix those problems anyhow, basically? Do you know what I'm saying? But this again, this is a real, this is stuttering philosophical discussion. But I think this is also a very, very, very important question to ask, because I'm not asking a blind person, for example, to that he should slightly see better, for example, as well. I mean, this is a inherited condition. Yeah. So again, please bear this in mind as well. That's also one of my messages, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate what you were saying about helping us become better listeners, really is what it boils down to, right? Where I'm able to, I'm able to maybe ask for clarification, or I'm able to indicate in some way that I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that, but maybe not offering the suggestions that aren't that helpful, because like you said, it's not like you're doing this on purpose, or it's not necessarily voluntary, and you may not be able to turn off or on, right, that easier or more paced style of speaking. But then if you choose to do so, great, or maybe you can do that if you choose to be able to clarify or in some way repair the communication exchange. But you're not saying to them, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, right?
Yeah. But okay, but having said that, all of that before, I think I mean, I think it's still the responsibility of the people, of the person who clutters as well, of course, to have a a fluent conversation. But that doesn't mean, of course, a fluent speech, but a fluent conversation. So I think both the listener, but of course also the person who's stuttering or cluttering, they are both there in the conversation. So they are both, in my view, of course, responsible for a flowing for a good communication.
Yeah, I like how you said that. Not fluent speech, but fluent communication, right? In the sense that you're being understood, that there is an exchange that you're following, they're following, and there is that back and forth exchange that is comprehensible, right?
Which also, which also includes, of course, the responsibility, I think, of the clutterer to understand what the listener is going through as well, right? So so all the cues that he or she is giving, that those are also important things for them to understand. So it's a mutual understanding and a mutual process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mutual responsibility for sure in that exchange. Yeah,
exactly.
What would you say the mental effort of using strategies, what is that like for you in terms of when you said, I go to work and you're much more maybe intentional or aware of how you're coming across or how you're communicating, maybe using more pauses. I think that's what I noticed most when you said, this is how I talk at work. And there was a little bit more pauses, right? And so how effortful is that for you? Would you say, because I know at least with people who stutter, some of the strategies or some of the things that they would do maybe intentionally sometimes are very draining. So would you say that's the same for you? Is it something that's very effortful, or do you feel like it's kind of become a part of what you do that's more natural?
In the beginning, so in my view, at least, is really important to practice a lot, right? So I think in the first 3 months or so, you should really, practice all these techniques a lot, and then it becomes much more natural to you, So so like you were saying, yeah, and once you know how things work, and then it becomes more easy. But to me, the most difficult part was, well, again, the mental part. So that includes, for example, things like, questions like, okay, so what would people think about me right now, right? Or can they follow me? Or self-blaming as well. So why can I slow down? Why why don't I have or feel control over myself, for example? All these kind of questions are there. And so, but also questions like, when you're, for example, talking fluently or slowly, I must say, when you're talking more slowly, which is the main goal, of course, in therapy as well, in the end, then that feels so unnatural to most people, to everyone I know, at least. And that also takes some kind of switch in your brain. Do you know what I mean? So for example, I had questions like, okay, oh, I'm talking too slow now, or I'm sounding like a robot, for example, or I'm not being myself right now. All these questions also are there, and again, what do people think of that? So it's both sides of the coin, basically. But I learned to convince myself, that that people in your environment don't you know don't well, they don't care, actually, when you're slowing down. So again, when I would talk like this, again, it feels like it feels so slow to me, right? But and then in the past, I had all these negative thoughts. Okay, so they are thinking bad of me or something, but that's not the case at all. And I also learned that by just asking people, what do you think of my pace, for example? And they were all so positive, right? So, and that is also important, I think, to mention. So there are lots of exercises, or lots of mental exercises that you can do to better train your brain. I'd like to say that.
After a day at work, if you are monitoring your speech and being intentional about using pauses or whatever it is that you might be doing, do you feel like it's taxing for you? Like, at the end of the day, are you tired? Are you feeling like, oh, like I just have really had to be on all the time? Or do you not experience that?
In the beginning, I was tired.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say, but after a while, again, when you're getting used to doing that, actually, I felt more and yeah, more energy, live, energy full, whatever, so because the thing is, when you're cluttering, again, with all these negative thoughts in your brain as well, that is a energy drainer as well, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that costs a lot of energy as well. So yeah, so the question is, in the end, what is more energy consuming, talking like like cluttering, or talking in a more controlled way? And now I would say the last one. But because it saves you, from so much, so much negative feelings and so on as well.
Mm-hmm. And maybe less frustration with
Exactly,
people because they maybe are understanding more, or you're having to provide less clarification potentially.
exactly. Yeah, you're
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yeah.
I know that you've been really open with your audience about your experiences, and I wonder if you could share a little bit about what it's been like to be so forthcoming about your experiences with cluttering. Has it opened doors for you? Has it been a positive experience to share?
Good. This is a very, very, very good question in my view. Well, yeah. Well, first of all, yes. This has been a very, very, very positive journey as well. Because again, to me, the most important thing is just sharing the story again. Raising that awareness, and so. Yes, so what I noticed in the past, for example, I was laid off in jobs several times in a row because of the cluttering, because people just, couldn't understand me. And and so then, after having more control over it, basically, I just noticed, that people also value me more as a person, also at work, but especially, of course, in the stuttering community as well. So, so people just value what I'm doing, apparently, which is really cool to me, right? And that gives me so much confidence. And actually, I wouldn't say, that the, well, the having control over the cluttering part when I want it, has led to open doors, for example, to me. But actually, I would say the confidence part has done that. So, so yeah, so because of me having much more confidence now, I think, you know, that has opened doors job-wise, or career-wise, So yeah, so this is for the first time, by the way, that I'm having a job now that lasts for 7 years. In the past, I was always 1 year, or maybe 2 years, or maybe 3 years, and then I was laid off again, right? So this is much more steady, much more, much more comfortable, actually. And so and actually, this is since 8 years, I have a long-term relationship as well. So yeah, there are all kinds of ways. I have more friendships. I just feel much more relaxed. There's so many parts in life that are much more positive for me right now. And again, it's not because of the control part, but it's more of the about the confidence part as well, I think. So looking back on the last 10 years, for example, I'm in a much better place now than I was before.
Thank you for sharing that. For our listeners who are not aware of your platform, and you mentioned a book earlier, uh, for our listeners who are not aware of all of the channels through which you've shared your story and been more open about your cluttering, where can they find you? Can you tell us a little bit about some of these additional resources that you've created, worked towards, posted? We would love to share them.
Sure, of course. The main thing I think is a website. So from there, people can find all kinds of resources, like like videos on my YouTube channel, for example. There's also a self-test, for example, on my website. Which is very easy. It has like 20 questions in it or something. So that gives you a preliminary, result or outcome, that could potentially, lead to a, diagnosis, for example, of cluttering as well. But yeah, and there are also ebooks on my website. I've written 2 books about cluttering, so you're right. There's, the original book, but there's also some sort of a light version of the book as well, which is all about the explanation part, basically. So without the experience part in it. And there's also a course, that I made on cluttering, very very recently, by the way. Yeah. So and there's also, by the way, a new book coming up, which is like a workbook, so with all kinds of exercises and assignments in it. Yeah. So yeah, so there is a lot, for people to digest, I would say. But I would also, like to mention the ICA website, also for SLPs, by the way, because there's, much more information on the theoretic part of cluttering as well. And there's also one Facebook group, I believe it's called Cluttering Speech, it's called, yeah. And there are also, many more, posts on in there. So yeah, so all in all, finally there are so many more, things to look at for SLPs, and also for the consumers, so to speak.
That's awesome. We will list all of those references, including your website and your YouTube channel, in our show notes. So anyone who's listening while they're driving or running or whatever it is people are doing, all of that will be listed and written down for you. Before we say goodbye, are there any additional thoughts or shares that you would like to offer before the end?
Well, actually, no. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I'm just, so thankful for this podcast, of course, of you. You are doing a tremendous work with this. So yeah. So let's all just, keep sharing the word of cluttering, obviously, and that could very, very much help.
I just so appreciate just your willingness to share. And I'm going to just add a couple of things that I don't think you did mention is you, I think, have been on a couple of other podcasts too. Cluttering Conversations is one, right? And then I think the Stuttering Foundation. So there's more of your story out there. So I just really recommend that people check that out. And I'm actually taking your course right now. So I'm excited to finish it and learn more. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here, Rutger. This was really a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon.